Go.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Beaker, and I'd like to welcome you to Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, held here at the Nebraska History Museum on the third Thursday of each month. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about Historical Society activities and programs, can be found on our website, www.nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Lincoln historian and Nebraska State Historical Society trustee Jim McKee has authored books and numerous newspaper articles on the history of our city. His newest work, in conjunction with Ed Zimmer and Matt Hansen, will be a photo history of Lincoln. Today, Jim will talk about his favorite Lincoln buildings, some of which are standing and some of them are not. I might add my favorite Lincoln building is St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the old one. That's where I was born. Anyway, Jim.
Kind of figured that was the reason. And I was born in Lincoln General, but not one of my favorite buildings. Kind of a fun program to give, and I have not seen this myself, so maybe I'll be surprised as we go. I threw it together and have picked buildings that are gone and buildings that are extant, and I've kind of mixed them up, some standing and some are not. And it's a good one because no one can correct me. I know what my favorite buildings are, and I'm right here. And also, it's an open-ended question, so I think I've picked enough to go way beyond today. And you won't see your favorite buildings in here probably, maybe one or two of them. And I've saved some of my favorite buildings down the road. Probably won't get in here today. Now, this is not a building, obviously, that you're going to recognize just yet. We're going to be talking about maybe my favorite building of all, and I think it's the one that they used to advertise this series. This is a picture of a stonecutter. He's standing in the middle of the doorway right there. You can barely see him. It's one of the very, very, very few pictures we have of Mr. Tyler. Mr. Tyler's stone yard was down near the railroad yards, and his house still stands at about 8th and D on the northeast corner of the intersection. A really interesting house, and that's your assignments, to go down and look at Mr. Tyler's house. He and his brother were a stone cutting and architectural team, and at least two of their buildings still exist because the house is still there. When the city of Lincoln formed, it had, of course, first been known as Lancaster, and there had been a post office here at Lancaster. But, of course, before Lancaster, there was also another post office called Gregory's Basin. And Gregory's Basin post office was probably approximately where the interstate cutoff divides the old Little Salt Lake, and it's now a park where they have the 4th of July. Is probably along the old Salt Creek banks in there someplace. And some of you are old enough to remember when Dr. White had his animal clinic, and probably very near Dr. White's animal clinic. That's where Mr. Gregory established his post office called Gregory's Basin. And he put his name on it because he wanted his name forever associated with the area of Lancaster County we call Lincoln. And you can see how well that worked for him. Nobody remembers Mr. Gregory. So as the city began to grow, and it grew first as Lancaster and then as Lincoln in 1867, its population was still about 30. Numbers vary, but we'll say about 30. And at that time, the mail came only infrequently, once a month perhaps. And the postmaster then, Mr. Jacob Dawson, who lived between 7th and 8th on O Street, had to go out to Yankee Hill to get the mail. So he had to go get it, because that's where the U.S. government took the mail from Nebraska City to Fort Kearny. And along that trail is where he had to go get the mail. But as the city grew, it grew in 1867 alone, as the capital came here. 1867, the population went from 30 to 800 in 1 year. So it grew very quickly. Mail delivery went from once a month to once a week, and pretty soon it's going to be once every day. But as this occurred, and we still see this across Lincoln and other places, the post office building was not a building owned by the federal government. First, it started in a kitchen of the Jacob Dawson cabin. It moved from rented room to rented room to rented room, till finally we find a committee is sent from Washington, D.C. to examine the city of Lancaster for a place where, Lincoln at that point in time, a place where a permanent U.S. Post Office, federal courthouse, and U.S. Customs House might be located. I never have figured out exactly why we needed a customs house this far from any border, but nonetheless, these three things are what they were looking for. They found the city of Lincoln, newly minted, small and growing very quickly, and they found a spot of land that they really liked because they said by standing in the middle of this block of land, they could see the rim of the prairie in all four directions. That block of land was between 9th Street, 10th Street, O Street, and P Street. Now, one of the reasons they could see the rim of the prairie in all four directions was it was a prominence. Another was there were no tall buildings, and thirdly, there were no trees. And by that I mean no trees, no trees. So standing there, it was easy enough to see why. This is the block they wanted, and there was also another advantage, there were no buildings on it. This was Market Square, a square block of land which had been given to the city of Lincoln by the state of Nebraska in 1867 by the Capital Commission and the state government. So they fell in love with this block of land, but it belonged to the city by sufferance to the state of Nebraska. So in order for them to sell that square block of land to the federal government, they needed to go back to the state legislature and get permission. And the state said, yes, you may sell that square block of land for what ultimately will turn out to be $1 plus other valuable considerations, but you must provide another square block of land for a market square. And they looked around the city, and there was just 2 blocks to the north another empty square block of land, which had been noted on the original plat as the historical block, the State Historical Society's property, where they would ultimately be able to build their first building. But there was nothing on it. The State Historical Society was not organized yet, so the city simply took it. And they then made that the public square, market square, if you will. Later, it will become that square block of land where we used to have the police department, fire department, and county city building. Then it became Market Square again, was used as a parking lot for many years, and today it is the site where we have the Lincoln Journal-Star Printing Company across the street to the north from Lincoln Journal Building. Now, if you remember other programs I've given, perhaps, or read, you'll know that the first Capitol building, literally the year it was done, started having a problem. And that was the stone it was made of started to dissolve. So the federal government knew that the local stone wasn't great. And one of the things they're going to do, the federal government does things never by half, and they're going to use a high-quality stone. They're going to use stone quarried from the Guire Brothers quarries near Plattsmouth. They're going to use it because, one, it's a very good quality stone, and secondarily, it's on the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad, which means they can then move that stone inexpensively and easily to the city of Lincoln. We move it on the railroad to the railroad yards. Mr. Tyler here sets up his yard to cut the stone. Construction is beginning in 1874 in May. And here we see a picture looking towards the southeast. We're looking across the block where the first post office will be. On the left-hand side, the 3-story uncompleted building is the First National Bank. On the right, we see things like David May Clothiers. This is the site which today has the terminal building. And if we look between the buildings, we'll see a building which is the Methodist Protestant Church. And if we look at the little dome above the First National Bank building, that is the dome of the First Capitol building, which had been completed December 1868, ready for service in January of 1869. So here we see the stone basement or the foundation going in. Now, before they could start construction of this building, however, one of the things that I mentioned to you was that the site was a prominence. They had to lower the grade of that block, 9th, 10th, OP, by 17 feet to bring it down to what's the present grade. A huge amount of earth had to be taken out. We think this is interesting, and we think it seems impossible today, but if you'll go down to the depot, at 7th and P Streets and head towards the east, you'll realize you have to come up a very steep hill. Well, in 1873, the hill kept going, and it was kind of a prominence right there. In fact, it would have been where the Capitol building should have been built, because the Capitol Commission wanted to build on the highest point of buildable land in the area that encompassed Lincoln. But this was not a buildable site. It would have had to have been, its grade would have had to have been lowered, as we see, by 17 feet to bring it down to the O Street grade today. So first thing I had to do was take out a lot of dirt, and here we see the stone foundation going in. 1879, it's a snowy day, you can see, and of course at this point in time the quarries, Guire Quarries and Plattsmouth will close. We can see a couple of things more clearly here. We can see the Capitol building, one of maybe a dozen photographs we have of that Capitol building. None of them really very good. This is not one of the best, but probably one of the half dozen best pictures we have. First National Bank building is completed. We can see still the building area where David May Clothier's is. We can see the Methodist Protestant Church, the first masonry church building in the city of Lincoln, the peaked roof just to the right of the First National Bank. On the left-hand side, we can see the Sweet and Brock Bank, the first bank in the city of Lincoln, and a little three-facade, three-faced building, which will become many of the firsts in the city of Lincoln. That will be where later the Clayton House Hotel will sit. We can see, too, in this picture for the first time, that the farmers who had been using this square block of land as a market square, so think of it as where the farmers market would be on Saturday, also where wagons would have stopped. If you were going through the area headed west in a covered wagon, this is where you would have camped. So it was a city campgrounds as well. And we can see that farmers are using it as a parking lot, if you will, because, of course, most of these farmers will come in and bring with them a wagon. And if you stop to think about it, parking a wagon on a street becomes very, very difficult. It takes up a great amount of space. So this is really a very handy spot for them. The stone foundation continues to go up, and in this picture we're looking towards the northwest. The street going left and right is 9th Street. So the intersection, you can see the spinning windmill back there. That is in the middle of the block, bounded by Barry's Bar and the Mill. Maybe that's why it's named the Mill, but I don't think so. That windmill will stand and slowly be absorbed and surrounded by a hotel. The windmill will stay there. They will use it to supply water to the hotel, and it continues to be grown around. The city of Lincoln at that point in history had about a dozen windmills supplying it with its fresh water. We can see interesting things in this picture. We can see the foundation is laid. We can see a wooden fence has been put along the O Street side as kind of a construction barrier, if you will. Another picture taken from exactly the same vantage, taken from the corner where First National Bank was in the last picture. We can still see the windmill back there spinning. We can see in the background below the horizon a white line. This will be the salt flats, which always appears on photographs as white because as the water evaporates and leaves the salt on the ground, of course it reflects light and becomes white. This is one of my favorite pictures, one of half a dozen favorite pictures, because of the little tiny white sign on that wooden fence along the O Street facade. This picture is probably taken winter 1875, 1876, because being a glass negative, we can blow that negative up, that picture up, until that little white sign, we can fill a whole wall with it. So we can read it very, very easily. Obviously, my picture is copied from a picture, so we can't do that with it. But when we blow that up, we see in the middle of it a black device of an American eagle, and above it the word centennial, announcing that the following July 4th, the United States will be 100 years old. Now that means that when this building is done, and it's still there, you and I can go up and lay our hands on a building that was built in the centennial year of the United States, and most of us remember 1976, when it was 200 years old, making that a very interesting building as a milestone. And one of the things it shows is how very, very young the city of Lincoln, the state of Nebraska, are in terms of the rest of the world and the United States even. So announcing the 4th of July in 19, yeah, this would be 1876, excuse me, 100 years. Now, this picture is taken from the intersection of 10th and P Streets, and we're looking towards the southwest. The flat roof building we see in the middle of the picture is where there's now a two-story parking garage on O Street. That's 9th and O. On the right, we see the upper floor of what many of you remember as Baker Hardware. Interestingly enough, you'll notice that we only see the top floor of this four-story building. Now, what does that mean? It means that towards the right we can see a hill of dirt, showing that the 17-foot grade has not been lowered yet on the north half of the block. What looks to be a tree growing in the upper right-hand corner is the glass plate negatives emulsion is being destroyed slowly. So it's not a tree at all. We can see the building now up into the third floor area. And more importantly, we can see that the construction is still going on and the farmers are still parking in there. And in fact, the contractor at that point in time makes mention in his notes about how they give him a mess of fits. He can never get anything done because the farmers keep parking in there. Two architects will have a finger in the building. Alfred Mullett will draw the original plans. He will not be there to finish it. A man by the name of William Potter will be on hand in 1879 when the building is completed. Now here the building is completed. Again, we're looking across that square block towards the southeast, and again we can see the First National Bank. We can see again probably the fifth best picture of the Capitol building. We can see the three-fronted building over here. And more importantly, we can see that now the building is finished, not yet occupied, but the farmers are still using it as a parking lot. They don't want to walk 2 blocks over to the current Market Square, the then current. Nothing changes, does it? We still don't want to walk 2 blocks. The total cost of the building is going to be about $200,000. Here is a picture taken in about 1881, 1882, 1883, about. We can tell that because now we have the second Capitol building has replaced the first Capitol building. The three-fronted building has new fronts on it. First National Bank is still there. And on the left we have a gazebo, and the north half of the block is occupied by a park, which is starting to grow up. And at the center of the intersection of the sidewalks is the saltwater fountain. The saltwater fountain was drilled even before the building started to give the city of Lincoln, at that time they hoped fresh water. It didn't happen because, the water that we drill even in downtown Lincoln today is going to be salt water. But it turns out that salt water is, one, good for fighting fires, which is one of the things that they were after. And secondly, because it tasted so god-awful, it would cure anything. Yeah. So people came, we have notes that they would bring buckets and jars and take this water away from the city and drink it later as sort of a health curative. The gazebo and the park will continue to grow up for some little time. The federal government said this was the third most impressive U.S. post office building west of the Missouri River. But if you listen to me, you'll find out that ultimately everything in Lincoln is the best or the finest or the largest west of the Missouri River. So not too surprising that the federal government said. So that building is my favorite of all the buildings that's still standing. And now let's look at a building which isn't still standing. This house stood where my office sat for about 17 years. It is the home of a man by the name of J.D. McFarland. He was the land commissioner for the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad when he came to the city of Lincoln in 1871. A land agent for a railroad is a very prestigious, a very remunerative position, and it's sort of like saying to somebody, here are the plates for $20 bills. Have at it. You literally can make money by being the land agent. So he builds a house which will occupy a quarter of a square block. The address of his house, it's 1320 Q, but the address would be, there's a Wendy's in there right now. Left and right runs Q Street, and to the right is 14th Street, and then on the block down it would be 13th Street. He was very successful. He was, along with a man by the name of Albert E. Tuzelen, and one other man, the owner of what we think of today as Havelock. And it was a vast piece of land. He was also a vice president of the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad. He was the second president of the First National Bank of the city of Lincoln. He owned the Lincoln District Telegraph Company, which of course preceded the telephone company. He owned the Lincoln Horse Car Lines, which preceded the trolley car lines and the bus lines. Unfortunately, a panic in 1893, think of it as a national depression, wiped him out. It really wouldn't have wiped him out, except one of the two banks he owned was the Capital National Bank. And the stockholders of the bank came to him and asked him to save the bank. By infusing his personal fortune, not one dime of deposits or one dime of stockholder equity was lost. The bank was saved. Mr. McFarland lost everything. Went to California, lived his life with his daughter. The house was sold, became many, many things. It was a hospital, Doctors Ramey and Carruthers Hospital. It was a boarding house. It was a headquarters for an insurance company and so forth. Until 1929, 1930, another depression is about to come along, but at that point it's torn down by a firm called Martin and Day. They're still in business today under farm management, but Martin and Day put up around the city sort of a combination, if you will, of Skelly filling stations and Safeway grocery stores. The Safeway grocery store is still there. It is directly adjacent, absolutely cheek by jowl, to Nebraska bookstore. The Skelly filling station was torn down and became the Wendy's. And we think some of the lumber in this house probably went into the construction of that Safeway store. The house itself is rather interesting. It was built in 1888, and it cost at that time $50,000. $50,000 is a considerable amount of money at that point in time. We'll see a little bit later on what $50,000 will build. It is made of stone and brick. It has a slate roof, has a fireplace in every room, of course, because at that point in time there was no central heating. Every room in the house was paneled in a solid wood, not a veneer, but a solid wood from a different country. And according to Mr. McFarland, it was apparently his wife that dictated the house. And he felt that this was a tremendous amount of money to be wasted, and that he trained his parrot every night when he came home from work and entered the house to say, "Damned fool," for spending $50,000 on a house. Wouldn't think so much of a $50,000 house today, but an amazing amount of money at that point in time. Nurses Training Hospital and so forth. And I said it was torn down in 1929. Dr. Walter Beggs, who I knew quite well, was the dean of the education school, actually lived in this building when it was a dormitory, or boarding house, I should say. This is an aerial view, and I throw it in only to show you. If you look clear on the right-hand side, just above the door frame, a little bit above that, you can see the huge McFarland House sitting in there. This is taken from the top of another building, which we'll see in a minute, one of my favorite buildings, which is the Security Mutual building that stands at 12th and O Streets. And a series of these pictures were taken from this vantage. It was at that time a 6-story building, so the highest building in the state. And we can look out across towards the northeast and see way back there an interesting building, not happens to be one of my favorite, but it sat at 14th and U, or 14th and V. And that was the first dormitory, a privately owned operation for the University of Nebraska. This would be directly across the street east from Morrill Hall. It was put together by private funds as a dormitory, and it failed. It failed almost at once. Even though the amount of money charged was very, very low, it was so far from the campus that the students would not walk that far to classes, so it failed, unfortunately. Today, it wouldn't even be the middle of the campus. It wouldn't even be the edge. Another one of my favorite buildings, this is one of the architect's early drawings, is First Plymouth Congregational Church, arguably the second or third best built, finest building in the state of Nebraska. It was built at the same time, roughly, St. Cecilia's Cathedral in Omaha. Both of these buildings are considered to be exceptional buildings. The Capitol building, of course, we always reserve for the #1 spot for obvious reasons. The First Plymouth Congregational Church comes about as a merger of two churches, the first Congregational Church, which sat on the south half of the block where the Cornhusker Hotel sits today, and Second Congregational, or Plymouth Congregational Church, whose building sat, and it still sits, at 17th Street and A. So those two combined, they sold the land to the Lancaster Hotel Company to make the Cornhusker Hotel. And at that point in time, they began planning a new building. And the new building will be built at 20th and D. And the original site will encompass two mansions. The mansion on the corner was the Winton Carlisle School, a private school. So these plans are drawn by a man by the name of McGonigal. McGonigal was one of the 10 finalists to build the Capitol building in their contest, if you will. McGonigal, an architect back in New York, was approached by the minister at that time, Ben Weiland, and charged with building this building. His instructions were fairly simple. They wanted a church which would be the new vernacular American church building. The old vernacular would be the one you think of when you think of a New England church: rectangular, white, clapboard, rectangular, 2 stories tall with a steeple on one end. That's the vernacular. This building, he is charged with making the new American vernacular. In other words, this will be the church that all other churches will be patterned after. That didn't work either. Not at all. So he designs the church. He's been back to Lincoln once because he was one of the 10 finalists to build the Capitol building. He goes back to New York, and when he comes back to present his plans to the congregation, and that, I think, is probably the toughest job an architect could have, is to present plans to a committee. Because, you know, if you got 10 people, you got 10 ideas. He comes back, he's won the competition, and one of the first things he says is, I want to change my entry. Because in coming back on the second time, and coming back to design the Capitol building, he said one of the things he wanted to do was build a building that would fit into the environment. So the building he designed will be designed rather fancifully, if you will, to encompass a lot of church things and other things in the Midwest. One of them will be a farm. And this farm is not based on a Midwest farm so much as, an ancient farm in Germany or England or Europe, where they would build a quadrangle, which could then, in case of a marauding attack or maybe even a fire or something like that, the people from the community could come into that quadrangle and they would live there in safety. So if you are familiar with the church, you know there is that quadrangle. Also, the tower would be a silo. Fanciful, of course. The sanctuary building would be a barn. So again, fanciful. Now this is the original plan, and it didn't quite come about the way he intended it to. Nothing ever does. These were the original ones. He was also charged with spending no more than $450,000, which seems like an adequate firm, but was not, as it turned out. Nothing ever is. Olson Construction Company was the contracting firm that did it. The building was pretty much paid for, but you got to remember this building was being built 1929. 1929, 1930 was the best of times, soon to be the worst of times. The Depression was just on the doorstep. But they did raise enough money to where when they sold their old building to the Lancaster Hotel Company, and they will ultimately sell their building at 17th and A, which will become Swedish Lutheran Church, will become First Lutheran Church, which will then build out at 70th and A. They will have enough money with the pledges to pay for the building. And as I said, it didn't work out that way. The building has interesting stonework in it. For example, it has a stone from Martin Luther's birthplace, his home, from the hearth. It has a stone called the Pilgrim Stone, which is where the pilgrims took off from to come to the United States, and a stone from Bethlehem. So another early drawing in this time in wash watercolor showing the Carillon Tower, which will be the central feature of the building, of course, when it's ultimately completed. And here it is under completion, not quite yet completed. The Carillon is 100, or the tower, Carillon Tower, is 171 feet. It is variously described as a 20-sided or 16-sided building. It depends on whether you count the sides on the inside or the outside. When it was completed, it was the only true Carillon in the state of Nebraska or any state which touched Nebraska. This is because a carillon, by definition, must be have true bells, not electronic bells. It must be able to be played from a keyboard, and this is a keyboard where you strike it with your fists, more or less. And secondly, it must have enough bells to accommodate a certain number, more than an octave, and I don't know what the exact number is. 48 bells were ultimately placed in the bell tower. There it is under completion. Looks pretty much like that today, except for the car in the foreground. The plan was modified considerably. Certainly the bell tower was modified as well. This is the tower itself. Around the upper part, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The bells which you see here are not singing or playing bells. All those bells are within the tower. Above the door, the rose window, lots of devices. The building also encompasses, I think it's 12 different colors of brick. And these colors are all colors which are found in nature in the United States. Interior of the sanctuary, and shortly after this it was completed with stars on the ceilings affixed where they would have been configured at the birth of Christ. Those have fallen and will be replaced. The narthex, and my next favorite building. This is an interesting building, possibly for more reasons than you can think of. This building was the Nebraska Christian University building. If you remember it as Cotner University or Cotner College. It was originally built for Nebraska Christian University. And the reason it, to me, is one of the most important and interesting buildings, though no longer there, was I grew up in the village of Bethany, where the building sat, empty, but in the hands of a caretaker, completely, always intact. The windows were not broken out as they would ordinarily be in an abandoned building. The grass was mowed, the trees were trimmed, and so forth. And it sat on about a roughly 3 square block campus, roughly, at Cotner Boulevard in Francis is where it was centered. But I saw this building every day growing up, and it looked like a castle on a hill there. And one of the things which captured my imagination and got me interested in the history of Lincoln and history in general and architecture was certainly this building. Nebraska Christian University was set up the same way Nebraska Wesleyan was and Union College, in that a group of private investors put together a parcel of land and offered it to a denominational school. Their hope would be that they owned several hundred acres of land, and in offering, say, 60, 80 acres of land to a denominational school, that they would build a college on it. And then around the college would grow a community. And with the community's growth, the land that they did not give would be worth 100 times more than they had paid for it, and it would become an economically viable real estate plan. That didn't work either. They financed it, the building itself. They first offered it, by the way, to the Baptists, and the Baptists said no thank you. They weren't interested, and ultimately they went to the Nebraska Christian Church, and they accepted the proposition. They were given lots around the building as well as the campus itself, and they could auction off those lots to make money to help pay for the building. This is a picnic which was held precedent to one of the auctions, and you can see the people have come there. They're going to actually go about 3 blocks to the north where there was a grove of trees to have their picnic. But the people who were standing up on top reported that by standing up there, they could see Nebraska Wesleyan clearly. They could also see downtown Lincoln, because at this point in time, there still weren't any trees to intercede all that much, and certainly no tall buildings. If all of the lots they sold at that auction that day, which were sold on very easy terms, they sold $8,315 worth of lots, 39 lots, only 20, some of them were ultimately paid for, because another depression is going to interfere. If all those lots that had been bought at the auction were paid for, like Nebraska Wesleyan or Union College, Nebraska Christian University might still be in business today. This is the building in completion, and this is how I remember it pretty much. This is an earlier picture, of course. It faced on Cotner Boulevard, early called Saunders Avenue. However, a depression, 1893, same 1893 depression we talked about a minute ago, is going to come along. It will threaten very greatly Nebraska Wesleyan, who escapes by the skin of its teeth. But they will not. Ultimately, the school will be saved briefly by a man from Omaha, a banker who had Lincoln connections, whose name was Samuel V. Cotner. And one of the things he got was the street named after him, which stuck even after the city of Bethany came into the city of Lincoln. He also gave them land and money. He gave them the land which today we think of as Bethany Park. He thought that they could then sell this land, Bethany Park land, and also get money to help pay off the school. It just did not work at all. So, an interesting building no longer there. This is looking at that same building, looking towards the south, and we can see the city of Bethany's water tower just to the left, or it would be a few feet to the east of the building. And this, of course, building is still there, and this is Nebraska Wesleyan. Nebraska Wesleyan's building still stands. It's Old Main. Was designed by a man by the name of O.H. Placey. He was given $1,000 to build the building and also to design the building. I mean, also oversee its construction, sorry. When it was done, it cost around $85,000, roughly, something like that. I'm looking at my cards down here that are talking about the City Hall, so I'm falling a little bit behind. Most of what I'm telling you, I'm just making up off the top of my head. So. Okay, 3 stories tall plus basement. The walls were primarily red brick, but this foundation is stone, and it's Milwaukee cold pressed brick. The building has everything in it, just as Cotner College and the University of Nebraska's original buildings, everything was in one building. Not true of Union College, but in this case it was. 30 classrooms, a museum, clock tower, which stood 30 feet above the rest of the building. The building was 150 by 71 feet and as a footprint almost the same as our first Capitol building. 2 things which did not last well with the building. There is a flat spot below the peaked gable on the right, which would be the south side, which said, and there was light. And if you would go around to the north side, there was another saying up there said, let there be light. Last I knew, the south facing, you could still just barely read those letters up there of that, not brought back when they redid the building. Gibbs and Parker, the architects, the basement had 9-foot ceilings. It was a walk-in basement, and down there they placed the science rooms because they wanted to keep the chemistry odors and so forth away from the rest of the building. Most of the interior walls were the same on the first floor, second floor, and third floor. The exception to that was in the southeast corner, the second and third floors, was where the auditorium was. And they were obviously 2 stories tall. Originally, when you walked into the building and you walked up towards the east, up the staircase, which will wind around, when you get to the first landing, you will be at the Holman Hunt Light of the World window. And if you turn to the right, you would see this large ghost of a door. And this door originally went directly up from this landing up to the auditorium and figures into a long story which we won't get into today, but it's still there. This sort of, they called it the chute, so that you could go directly up. But everything in the building really still there from the original, just virtually everything. A house, which I find very interesting. We do have photographs of it. Maybe we'll see one. I'm not sure. I can't remember whether the photograph and this in or not. It was built by a man by the name of Carlos Burr, B-U-R-R. He and his brother were attorneys. They came from Dixon, Illinois in 1868, so the city of Lincoln would have been 1 year old when they arrived. At that time, Carlos had with him $270 in order to start his life here. He immediately turned 260 of it over to a carpenter to build him a little cottage. It was at 8th and S, so a long ways from here. He also then had to go to work to pay for some of the other stuff. He built his own tables, chairs, and beds because he was out of money completely. He tried to get work as an attorney, couldn't get it. He had a lot of adventures. He worked for the U.S. Land Office, but not as an attorney. They hired him to split wood that they could burn in their stove. Finally, he got $6 a month as a retainer from them. Ultimately, he was twice elected to the city council. Twice he was a state senator. He was the mayor of the city of Lincoln in 1885. This little house he built was at 1530 L Street. On his death, it became the Rogers Law Firm office, then the headquarters of the Shrine Bowl. This would be the parking lot directly east of the Shrine building, across from the Capitol building. He also, along with his brother, will build the Burr Block, which we'll see in a minute. This building is still standing, another one of my favorite buildings. This is the building which, if you saw terms of endearment, this was, what did they call it, Kearney State College, I think, or something like that. It had a sign out in front of it. It was originally built to be the library for the University of Nebraska. Today it is the Architecture College building and is on the National Register of Historic Places in the United States. It is the 5th building to be built on the university's campus. And of course, the original library was in Old Main, which stood more or less in the middle of the area directly to the west of Sheldon Art Gallery. And its footprint pretty well fills up a lot of that grassy area in there. So this building was built in the 1890s. The firm, they started thinking about a library 1888, 1891. Omaha firm of Mendelsohn, Fisher, and Lowy designed the building. They got a little money from the legislature to pay the architects. And of course, then, as now, the legislature, then 2 houses, would dole out a little bit of money, and then they'd dole out a little more, and then they'd dole out a little bit more over the years. So the first part of the building will be built is the building to the right, and that's got a steel frame structure. This will become the stacks for the library. Then the legislature will slowly pass out money. And it looks like to the students the building's never going to get done. And in fact, there's one year where virtually nothing happens. So the students go out around the building, and where there's dirt piled up, they plant corn. And when the corn starts to come up, they take photographs, take it to the legislature and say, come on, finish our building. The legislature, they wouldn't do this today, I don't think. They did. They gave enough money to finish the building. So ultimately, we're going to have the building done. But by the time we get to the second phase of the building on the left, we're not going to have enough to make a steel frame building. It's going to be wooden frame. This is the building in use as a library. This will be after we move from Old Main into this building. And then from this building, we'll move ultimately into Love Library. This is the east staircase, which looks in this picture exactly as it did when the building was completed in about 1895. And an interesting place to visit, if you can get up there, is the 5th floor, or the attic originally. Now it's Carroll's for graduate architects. And you can see the building on that side, the south side of the building. No steel structure, it's all wooden beam construction, and the walls are masonry, load-bearing walls. To get up there, you can see how all these wooden pieces fit together to hold the building together. Another building which it was there a year ago, but is no longer there. In about 1940, late 30s, a lady started a restaurant outside of Lincoln in a little village called Emerald, which is several miles to the west of the city of Lincoln. She decides, however, that the house that she started the restaurant in is inadequate, and she decides to build a new building this side of Emerald, but still not in the city of Lincoln. But she discovers in 1944, when she wants to start building the building, that she can't get all of the building materials she wants, so she cleverly puts up a rather spindly steel framework for the building. Then in between the steel, where you might use concrete blocks or you might use brick, she stacks bales of straw. Then she just gunnites or cements over that straw. This is the building in construction. The building, when it's done, will be called the Lone Oak. The Lone Oak was very prosperous for a good number of years. It was outside the city of Lincoln, which one of the things that made it prosperous, because Lincoln didn't have liquor by the drink. So this is the building in construction, in completion, and you can see how deep the windows set in the building because they're the depth of a bale of straw. 1958, her common-law husband, Tom Bentley, they had a little tiny house, also stuccoed, just to the southeast of this building, and Tom, not the sharpest knife in the drawer, decided to put in a hot water heater, not realizing that a gas-fired hot water heater needs to be vented. So Nola Bailey, Tom Bentley, and their St. Bernard dog were asphyxiated in the building in 1958. It became a series of unsuccessful restaurants, or increasingly unsuccessful restaurants, until finally, a number of years ago, it was purchased by a contractor who used it to store equipment around it. About 2 years ago, it was discovered that although they had purchased the material to re-roof the building, and the material is actually sitting outside the building, tar paper and tar and so forth, they had not gotten around to it. The ceiling began, or the roof began to leak, and as the roof leaked, water got into the baled straw. As water got into the baled straw, mold and insects took over. County Health Department said it has to go. So the only baled straw building that I know of ever built in Lancaster County came down a few months ago, just bulldozed. Wasn't much left holding it together. Nola Bailey had never used the upper floor. She used it virtually all for storage because she was afraid that it wasn't structurally sound. Subsequently, some of those other restaurants did use the upper floors and had no problem at all. Another building which is extant, and that is the building we see right on the corner right there. In fact, all the buildings are extant, but we're not interested in anything except the one on the corner. It was built by the Seton and Lee Iron Works, who were from Atchison, Kansas. And in Iron Works, they came to Lincoln and built this on the northwest corner of 8th and Q Streets, and you'll recognize it. It's still there. It's had many, many tenants through the years. The building on the corner was the pattern shop originally. Then it became a warehouse. Seton and Lee had its foundry directly to the right or to the north in this picture, and they were making things like hitching posts, probably person hole covers, anything that are made of cast. We used to call them manhole covers. We can't do that anymore, of course. And later, the building will be bought and be operated by Sullivan's as a storage. Then some of you remember in 1991, it became La Paloma, the restaurant, and that gentleman brought the caboose in behind and set it on one of the many spur tracks that used to run through the Haymarket. Then it became, let's see, the Brazen Head, Bechamel, the Capital City Grill, Magnolia, and it's got a new name now. It just opened, and I'm ashamed to say I can't remember what the name of it is. But does somebody know the name?
Lead Bellies.
Lead Bellies, okay, right. And the building is very carefully preserved. It's the oldest building probably in the Haymarket area. Right across the street we have another old one, the old Biscuit Company. This is probably the oldest building. Made of very soft brick, but the thing that makes it even doubly interesting is when Seton and Lee built it, the sills and capitals of the windows are metal, so that if you take a magnet with you, you can see that they look like they're concrete, but they aren't. And Lead Bellies is owned by a man who has a restaurant way out towards the northwest, so he knows what he's doing. We hope it lasts very well, and he's put a lot of money into the building. And of course, Haymarket is changing so fast that it's almost staggering. But the little caboose is still back there. Thank you, Tom. Another building which is not still there is this Chautauqua building. And I will use the term Chautauqua loosely. because it was many things. It was Epworth Park. And Chautauqua-like use is what it's most noted for. It was built by the Epworth League of the Methodist Church. Go to First and Van Dorn Streets and turn left or to the south on First Street. First Street, half a mile down the road to the south, will come to an abrupt end, and you'll see a large set of arched gates. That was the entrance to Epworth Park. Epworth Park also dredged a large lake, a donut-shaped lake in the middle, and built this, the large auditorium, the open-air amphitheater, which they said would seat around 3,000 people. It's obviously a floating target because it's open air, and I think the next picture will show us with 3,500 people in it, and you can see that it would expand or contract. Down on the stage, probably not William Jennings Bryan, but it's the sort of thing that they had out there. This was an extremely successful park modeled after Lake Chautauqua, New York. But it was more successful in its day. They advertised this park, Epworth Park, as the largest gathering place, you getting this down, on the North American continent. And laugh though we might, it certainly came very close. They had hotels, they had a post office, they had hundreds of houses, they had dormitories, they had restaurants, they had bookstores, they had permanent accommodations within the park for 2,500 people. So, although we laugh, maybe one of certainly the largest gathering places on the North American continent, and it's right there. Not much left that we can find because it was virtually wiped out by floods that culminated over a period of years, but the last one was the 1940s, just literally wiped it off the face of the earth. At the same time, the thing that had caused this to become so extremely successful was that people would come from states and states away. Thousands of people would come every day. They would come on the trolley car. They would come on the Burlington Railroad, which had a spur which went directly out here, because they were captives. But with the coming of the automobile, they could go whenever they wanted, wherever they wanted, and that became one of the things which drove it out of existence. The floods were simply the capstone, and it went away. Now, that, Tom tells me, is probably where I should stop. And if I'm ever invited back, I will pick it up with this building. This is also the Burr block. This is the building that the Burr brothers, Carlos and C.C. Burr, built on the northeast corner of 12th and O Streets. You look at the building and you'll say, I recognize that building. Right? Wrong. That building is not there. The building which is there is not exactly this building. And I'll sort of leave you with that as a temptation. And are there any questions? Maybe this would be a good time to see if we have any questions. Of course, I can't see out there, so even if you have any questions, I might not see your hands. If not, Tom, do you have any other words of wisdom? Or have you gone back taking a nap? I don't know where Tom went. If not, we thank you very much for your attendance, and I hope someone will be there to bring the lights back up so that you don't stumble on your way out. I appreciate your attention. If you have questions now that you were afraid to ask before, why, I'll be around for a few minutes. Thank you very much.